just double checking. Things look okay on my front. Let me know in the comments if this is coming through all right. And you can see me. Everything's going well. Let me know in the comments. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be discussing one of what I believe to be one of the more serious effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the impact that it's going to have on the wider world. I think it's very true. I can often be in a position where I'm trying to downplay certain everything has changed approaches to geopolitics, but I think this is a case when it's very true. Things really have shifted dramatically over the past week and a half since, I guess, 9 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think it's important to start thinking seriously about what that means what that means for Syria, which is a country that I've spent a lot of time studying and have some very confirmed opinions on that I'll reintroduce to all of you. We'll discuss in a presentation what Russia's invasion of Ukraine means for sanctions against Russia and how that's going to impact, how I believe it's going to impact Russia's activities within Syria, and how those effects are, I believe, going to be quite negative. Also, and at the end, we'll talk a bit more about the current status of affairs in Ukraine. Obviously, I am not going to be a great source on how the battlefield is developing. I don't have a lot of OSINT stuff, but I think I do have one general principle for something that we should pay attention to over the course of this weekend. I think the most important thing is what happens in Kherson. There's a place I used to call Kherson. We're all getting an education this past week, this past 10 days. But Kherson, I think what happens there is going to be very determinative of how the conflict goes in Ukraine for the duration. So before we get started, some preliminaries. I've got a presentation I want to run through. Going to be talking about Syria a lot, going to be talking about Ukraine a lot. During that period of time, I'm not going to be paying any attention to the comment streams. We do have a moderator. You're invited to say anything you want to me, about the ideas I'm presenting. You're allowed to talk at within broad ranges about what's happening in the conflict. Of course, we have an ongoing war here, so I don't really want any kind of sort of genocidal statements about Russians or Ukrainians. That is not allowable. But generally speaking, you can say whatever you want about ideas and about me. We do ask that you be civil to the other people in the chat. Please don't be disruptive to the chat. Please be pleasant to the people in the chat. We have a moderator, Loga Cool Extreme. Loga is the moderator. If he sees you doing something that we've identified as not helpful to the chat, he will warn you, and if you persist in your behavior, he will block you. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. What he says goes, so please listen to him. If you want to do super chats, I'm of course very grateful to that sort of thing, and we'll answer any questions from folks with super chats, but please hold off on that until we start the Q&A period, half hour, 40 minutes from now. I'm always happy for super chats. It's you guys that keep this channel going. All right. So the first thing to say, I think, I'm not running as scared as a lot of folks, might be right now. Tucker Carlson had to give like an abject apology for his support for Russia and what have you. But I do think it's a period of time that's very clarifying. And some of you may be surprised if you're new to this channel, how positive I'm going to be about the Russian intervention in Syria. And I am very positive about the Russian intervention in Syria. In fact, I think that Russia actually acted for Syria a lot along the lines of the way that NATO is acting for Ukraine in terms of helping against an outside aggressor. But I think it's clarifying at this point, and I have to be clear from the outset that what's going to happen to Syria, what's going to fall apart in Syria is entirely the fault of Vladimir Putin, because he made this insane choice to invade his neighbor in an extraordinarily destructive fashion. Made a gamble that has already lost. It only become, Putin's gamble in Ukraine has already lost. It only remains to be seen to the extent to which that gamble will fail. And the reason that, as I believe, we're going to see greater instability in Syria over the next 6 to 8 months is again because Putin did this invasion. I do also, as a clarification before all of my Syria stuff, I have to point out that yes, 100%, Assad is a bad man. Bashar Assad is a mass murderer. He's a bad person. He's the worst possible leader for Syria, except for all of the other options that the United States and the West have provided over the past decade. Yeah, I'm not an apologist for Assad. I'm not someone who's particularly interested in picking apart the chemical weapons bureaucracy's decisions on whether or not he's used chemical weapons. I'm fully concede that Bashar Assad is a nasty bastard, but he's also better than anything that the United States proposed. And I think that's a really key point to point out. I'm not a Putin fan. I'm not an Assad fan. However, I think it's quite straightforward to point out that Syria was happier after the Russian intervention than it was before. We had a civil war starting in Syria in 2011. I think what's really key, if you look at these casualty figures, these comes from the Syrian, SOHR. It's amazing that I've forgotten this name, but it's this Syrian Office on Human Rights, it's the standard place. Everybody trusts SOHR. They're actually quite anti-Assad. So I think it's very telling that if you look at the 2011, the grand total figures I've circled in red over here, you've got 7,000 people died in 2011. This is the era, to the extent that it ever existed, this is the era that froze Western commentary in place. This was an era where there was actually peace to some extent. Not that peaceful when you see that pro-government forces were already, Assad's military was already dying in large numbers, actually made up almost half of the casualties in the Syrian civil war in 2011. But this was the era when there were actual semi-peaceful protests. There were actual a few non-jihadists demonstrating against the Assad regime. That was in 2011. What happened towards the end of 2011 and in 2012, you had a massive intervention from the CIA. This is not gray zone propaganda. This is not crazy left-wing fantasizing. You can find New York Times articles referring to the largest CIA program in history, which was pouring money and weapons into Syria to create a jihadist movement against Assad. That may not have been the intention of every person at the Pentagon. That's what they did, because not only was this $1 billion provided by the CIA added to by this $1 billion from the CIA was also added to billions and billions from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, that really just functioned to turn what was quite possibly a legitimate, worthwhile protest movement against Assad into a jihadi nightmare. Turkey, of course, also played a large role in this. You'll see in 2012, 2013, 2014, things just got worse and worse. We got into a truly horrific situation. Here's a map from a video I put up in 2016. This is the big success that 5 years of CIA contribution had left. The rise of the Islamic State. I have referred often to the Islamic State as a U.S. proxy that got out of control. That's certainly controversial. What is not controversial is that this entire open space in northern Syria was opened by U.S. money, and U.S. money and Saudi money and Turkish money and foreign fighters that were supported and armed. Obviously, the United States wasn't too pleased when it turned out that most of that money and foreign fighters ended up going to the Islamic State. But anyway, we opened the space for the Islamic State. This is why the Islamic State rose. On the community page, I've got a detailed listing of why that happened. So yeah, this is what Syria looked like. The orange the purple bit was all that Assad controlled. It's important, however, to emphasize that that purple bit was also always where the vast majority of Syrian people lived. It's a very similar situation to what we have in Yemen today, where everyone's like, "Oh, look, the outside coalition, they control 70% of Yemen." Of course, 80% of the people live in the territory that the Houthis control in Yemen, and that is the case the case in Syria in 2016. What had been created was an absolute nightmare state and a truly just absolute buzzsaw for civilians. Truly horrific thing. In September of 2015, Russia intervened. I think it is entirely accurate to describe. I think it's entirely accurate to describe Russia's intervention as brutal and horrific. What's often left out is that so too was the U.S. intervention in Mosul, in Raqqa, the bombing campaigns in cooperation with the Iraqi government and the Syrian Democratic Forces. Those too were horrific, nasty bombing campaigns that resulted in tremendous losses of civilian life. It is exclusively the Russians that we're meant to pay attention to. And what's really fascinating is that, just on that specifically, SOHR is the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, is what that is. Just on that specifically, I researched this as just sort of back of the envelope, not anything particularly comprehensive. But the Syrian Observatory on Human Rights estimates that in the first 2 years of Russia's intervention, they killed 5,703 civilians. That's horrific. That's terrible. In the U.S., I think it was a 5 or 6 month campaign to take Mosul, and in Iraq alone, the body count was 5,000 to 11,000 civilians. I've often heard 5,000 civilians as the body count of the U.S. and the Iraqi government retaking Mosul for civilians, but Googling it this morning, I found, Associated Press and Amnesty International figures putting it at 9,000 to 11,000 dead civilians. So of course, when you are retaking a city from a bunch of jihadis, which is functionally exactly what Russia was doing in Syria, was what the United States was doing in Raqqa, which is in Syria, and Mosul, which is in Iraq, and in other cities in Iraq, but it was just reported completely differently. Regardless, I want to condemn both Russia and the United States for the savagery and the brutality of the bombing campaigns that retook Iraq and Syria from jihadists. It's worth pointing out that it was a United States CIA program that gave much of Iraq and Syria to the jihadists in cooperation with U.S. allies in Saudi Arabia, the rest of the Gulf, and Turkey. I think I'm proud. My intent here is to provide some support for my belief that the Russian intervention in Syria was actually a good thing, and the possibility of it getting weaker or fading away is something that we should lament. Here's one last look at these casualty figures. You'll note that in 2016, Russia is still heavily bombing in support of the Assad regime, kicking out jihadists. To be clear, there were elements of the Syrian rebel forces, and even in 2016, there were certainly people living in Syrian rebel forces controlling territory that were not jihadists, that did not want to live under strict Islamic law, did not believe in suicide bombing as a weapon of war. However, none of those people were the people who were actually fighting, like from 2012 on. It's Russia was primarily attempting to take territory back from jihadists, just as the United States was in Raqqa and Mosul. By 2016 and early 2017, Russia was largely successful. And what you can see here, past 2016, 2017, is casualties steadily falling until you get to 2021, which was, 3,000 people dead, which is, of course, a horrific, terrible total of death for the war in Syria. But when you compare it to every other year of the conflict, it means the war was essentially over. This is what Syria has looked like since 2019. It has been 3 solid years now. As you can see, the Assad regime controls the vast majority of the territory of its own country, the sort of orange territory out there that's controlled by the SDF. That is largely desert, as is most of Assad's territory as well. However, that coastal territory that Assad controls is where most Syrians have always lived. The multiple jihadist pockets throughout the Syrian territory that the United States was so concerned to preserve have largely been wiped out. That little white section up top there, that is the last bastion of the Syrian resistance, the Syrian rebels. It is run entirely by Al-Qaeda. That too is not, leftist conspiracy. That is, or Russian propaganda. That is an established fact. It is I can't even recall. Is it still Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? It used to be al-Nusra. It used to be, I think, before a 2013 split from the Islamic State, who, however, throughout that time, it has been run by a guy named Jolani, who is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, despite a sort of famous high-profile split from Al-Qaeda, which Al-Qaeda endorsed. It's an Al-Qaeda. It is an Al-Qaeda enclave. Now that the Islamic State has been largely defeated, its leaders are exclusively captured in Jolani's rebel enclave. Trump ended the U.S. support, military support to the Syrian rebellion. Thank God, long overdue. But humanitarian support and PR support continues. However, I think you can say with some confidence that this 2019 to 2022 map looks a hell of a lot better than this 2016 map and the nightmare that we had there. The fact that in 2021, what is that, a 20th? It's about a 20th as many people died in 2021 as died when the U.S. was running things in Syria. It's, I think, very telling that you may recall, if you were paying attention in 2016, hearing a ton about the savagery and the nastiness of Russia's intervention and how terrible it was. And then you haven't really heard much about Syria because the war was largely won, because we had a high degree of stability. Most of the news out of Syria in the past 3 years has been about these red bits up top. That is Turkish-occupied territory. You've got little Russian flags up there. And, of course, the drama over whether or not Trump would withdraw. Trump promised to withdraw from Syria multiple times, never, ever, ever delivered. We still have, to my understanding, U.S. troops backing up the SDF. The SDF, also known as the Kurds, also known as Rojava, also known as the YPG, also deeply affiliated with the PKK, a anti-Turkish terrorist group. The United States' continued presence in Syria is mostly there to keep those few thousand people dying. We have, nominally, we have that little bit down there in Al-Tanf, in the desert there. That base is nominally to hunt ISIS. ISIS is, I'm sure we find somebody to bomb with some frequency, but ISIS is largely a dead letter. U.S. troops are there mostly to block Syrian reconstruction. U.S. troops are mostly in Syria to block Syrian reconstruction, and we have a massive sanctions program, one of the most brutal sanctions programs we have, doubled down on in December in 2020 with the Caesar sanctions, as they are now known. And that, too, is to make sure that Syria can never rebuild. So it would be a terrible mistake to describe Syria as a happy country right now in any sense. It is extraordinarily poor. It has mostly been destroyed, and the United States is prohibiting any reconstruction by its continued access there. The continued presence of the United States also leads to a lack of balance, also keeps things on edge, keeps things topsy-turvy, and the incredible complexity of the United States, Russia, Turkey, the Syrian regime, and the Kurds, and Syrian rebels that are mostly just Al-Qaeda and or, not mutually exclusive categories, Turkish proxy forces. You've got all of these folks gambling back and forth, making borders complicated, keeping any kind of real government from returning. And of course, it's this instability that makes the potential return of the Islamic State a possibility, which is something that we should get much more worried about right now. Because one of the main things holding all of this together, holding Syrian peace together, is the Russian government and Russian military intervention, as well as Russian financial aid. And if you take Russia out of that, the potential of returning to a situation like this, while it certainly wouldn't happen immediately, is, I think, a very, very real possibility. And that is, well, horrifying, frankly, a truly, truly horrifying possibility. Let me just check how we're doing here. Yeah, we've got 100 folks here. That's nice. Is a truly horrifying possibility. I think it's important to talk about a bit. This is getting into Ukraine a bit here. Folks have been very surprised by the fact that folks have been very surprised by the fact that the Russians looked so impressive in Ukraine. The Russians looked so impressive in Syria, excuse me. The Russians looked so impressive in Syria. Oh, and they did. They legitimately changed this conflict. They ended this conflict. But the Russians have humiliated themselves in Ukraine. What's the deal here? And you can see, actually, it's because the footprint of the Russians in Syria has actually been quite small. This has been a dynamic that has been the case throughout the history of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Russia has the ability to sacrifice scientists, to sacrifice soldiers, to sacrifice economic development in other realms, the ability to sacrifice to reach, real pinnacles of high technology, to get to a point where it competes with the United States in the quality or sophistication of its weapon systems, but it can never compete with the quantity. This was an issue back in the 1960s when we would talk about the missile gap. Kennedy would talk about the missile gap between Russia and the United States, which simply did not exist. Up until the 1970s, the United States had vastly more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union did. Soviet Union did catch up a bit in the 1970s, mostly by using most of their incredible oil dividend of the oil crisis to build nuclear weapons, which is, of course, part of the reason why the Soviet Union fell. So the United States has always been extraordinarily paranoid, and for Russia's sort of nationalist, proud of itself purposes, Russia has sacrificed extraordinarily to get to the point where it puts together these forces, these nuclear forces, these high technologies. We've talked a lot about hypersonic missiles. We've heard a lot about recently. I think didn't Russia demonstrate a nuclear-powered missile recently? So it's very important for Russia's self-respect to be able to have these high-technology capabilities. It's also really great for the Pentagon because they can say, oh my God, look what Russia built a hypersonic missile. They must have thousands. And of course, that's not the case. Russia has dozens of really, really high-tech things that the United States has thousands of. We've seen this very quickly. I was humiliated in the first days of the invasion of Ukraine because I was entirely wrong about the quality of Russia's military, because I expected them to use precision-guided missiles to wipe out Ukraine's military very quickly. Russia has some precision-guided missiles, but not many. Whereas the United States, if the United States were to invade Ukraine, the first thing we would do would be to knock out every Ukrainian, or I suppose Russian at this point, military element before we put a single troop on the ground. Russia didn't have that capability. It had a whole bunch of nasty old Soviet tanks. That is very likely to be enough to do the job, but it's doing the job at incredible cost. So in Syria, the actual footprint of the Russian military that they had there to make an extraordinary difference in the Syrian conflict was tiny. I believe that the appropriate measure of the number of planes that Russia has is, I think, somewhere, I don't think it's publicly available information. My understanding is that at the peak of Russia's campaign there, they were using 30 or 40 or maybe, let's double it, 60. Maybe they were using 60 active planes to run sorties in Syria, to bomb the Islamic State, to bomb the jihadists, to bomb the Syrian rebels. 60 planes. And of those planes, and the system supporting those planes, it was possible for Russia to go and put its absolute best face forward. These were tiny numbers of professionals in their military and tiny numbers of actual planes. I think the Russian, this is just quick Googling, I don't know what this actually signifies, but apparently the Russian Air Force has something along the lines of 3,000 to 4,000 aircraft. In Syria, they used the best looking or the best maintained. It's not clear to me that they were only using top of the line, brand new, was it third or fourth generation stuff as far as fighter jets, but they were using the best maintained and the most impressive looking infrastructure, personnel, etc., to operate the tiny number of planes they were using in Syria. That was enough in Syria to entirely change the nature of the conflict and to allow Assad to crush the very unattractive and very completely uncoordinated rebel groups against him. Obviously, it's a very different problem for Russia to attempt to invade and take massive territory in their neighbor, Ukraine. It has been shocking to me, and I think most observers, how bad of a job that Russia has done at that. But I think part of that is partially actually our wish to make Russia look more powerful. It's important in U.S. propaganda to talk about what Russia was doing in Syria as some kind of horrific invasion. That's actually what Russia was doing in Syria is what the United States is doing in Ukraine right now, largely. Yes, Russia was actually doing bombing, but what they were doing was supporting an established government, which has certainly got a less legitimacy than a democracy, but a lot more legitimacy than the Western press was willing to concede. The fact is that Assad wasn't just supported by the Alawi minority that he belongs to. He was also supported by almost every Christian in the country, almost every Shia in the country, because the entire 30% of the country that had no interest in living in a Sunni state. And of course, as the conflict wore on, the growing numbers of Sunni Syrians who had no interest in living in the Islamic State or nightmare country out of the Quran, the way that the Islamic State and all of the other rebels that the United States was supporting were promising. So Russia in Syria was supporting a legitimate government, which is what the United States is doing in Ukraine right now. I think that's a really key point to make. So Russia was making a relatively tiny commitment of Russian resources, but it was also some of the best resources they had, some of the best logistics they had, and was supported to a very, very high degree. And I think almost all of that is in the process of being disrupted. I ran a short talking about this, I guess a day or two back, talking about just what sanctions mean. There's a tremendous amount of self-deception in the U.S. government and in U.S. foreign policy circles about how sanctions actually operate. I think the current propaganda push from the Republicans right now is that it's insanely outrageous and hypocritical, that the United States still buys oil and gas from Russia as we do, and especially that Europe buys extraordinary amounts of gas that they do. I think that's a valid point. It's a valid point, but it's a misunderstanding of what sanctions are going to do are already doing to Russian oil and gas production. We're seeing at this point, just 9 days into the conflict, we're seeing actually an increase, or actually this may have stopped today, but up until yesterday, we'd seen a massive increase in oil and gas flows into Europe from Russia, and with money going the other direction as well, sort of funding. But I believe that is sort of a last push, that is sort of a last gasp before even unsanctioned, U.S. oil and gas unsanctioned Russian oil and gas stops flowing. It's not going to stop flowing entirely, but it's going to slow down and get more and more limited. This is because of the way that sanctions work, that the United States government, foreign policy establishment, and media does not want to admit to itself. The United States is an abuser of sanctions. We put sanctions on everything. That's usually the first answer. This is especially true after the horrific disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan with the large numbers of U.S. troops that were lost. The U.S. public is no longer willing to allow troops to be sent. What we talk about is sanctions, and sanctions is always the answer. And our sanctions have gotten worse and worse. In the aftermath of 9/11, the United States was finally able to do something that it had wanted to do for years. We don't just sanction, when we sanction a country, we don't just say that U.S. businesses can't do business with this country anymore. We say that no businesses can do business with this country anymore. And we throw incredible legal resources from the United States government, from the entire U.S. court system against these countries. As the recent weeks have really emphasized, every country that has central bank reserves has significant portions of them in the United States. There is always a nexus for the United States to go after any country in the world. And more, horrific sanctions have been our approach, basically starving countries to death. I think that it's really fascinating, even brutal, nasty Putin and the brutal, nasty Russians, and I don't mean to diminish that. What Russia is doing to Ukraine right now is brutal and nasty and horrific. But it has agreed to allow humanitarian corridors out of and into these cities, because even Russia now acknowledges that it is an act of war and a violation of every sense of international law and common decency to use starvation as a weapon of war. That is, Russia is terror bombing high rises, civilian high rises, but even it acknowledges that it doesn't want to actually starve cities to death. That may change, that may get worse, but my understanding is that the current state of affairs, Russia is conceding humanitarian corridors to allow food to get in, to allow civilians to get out. The United States is so powerful that we don't need to send a military in there to besiege a city. We can use our military. We can use not our military, but our financial power to make it impossible to get food into entire countries. We are starving entire countries to death. This is what we're doing to Iran. This is what we're doing to Syria. This is what we're doing to Yemen. I'm not saying that no food at all gets in, but what I'm saying is that our sanctions make it tremendously difficult to get enough food and medicine into all of these countries. And we lie to ourselves about that. The way that we lie to ourselves, and this may seem like a long digression, but this is directly relevant to Russian oil and gas and how I believe that we have already sanctioned Russian oil and gas. So we tell ourselves in the United States, the foreign policy makers, the government folks, we tell ourselves that we're not actually, of course we're not sanctioning food or medicine to Iran. That would be horrible. We would never do that. We have this really involved system of licenses that, OFAC gives out. We will license organizations if you want to bring food or medicine in. We've got this whole bureaucracy we've set up to allow people to fill out applications to not get sued by the Department of Justice, to not to not lose all of your money in the US, you just have to go through this application process and then you'll be fine. And of course you can bring food. I mean, not always to Yemen, but you can bring food and medicine to Syria and Iran. We would never get in the way with that. That would be monstrous. That's a justification. I think you can already, a rationalization, and it is utterly incorrect. And I think you can already see the problem here. If you have to apply to the United States to find out whether or not you're allowed to bring food to a country, you're probably going to sell your food to a different country. It's these layers of complexity that are brought about by this sanctions architecture that not even the United States government fully understands. Or actually, the United States government actively chooses not to look at the ramifications of its sanctions policy in these countries. Because if you looked at it honestly, you'd see that we're violating the Geneva Conventions? Regardless, we're committing extraordinary humanitarian crimes of starvation and horror against countries like Syria, Iran, Venezuela, etc. This is a mythology. This is a self-belief that is about to be crushed by what happens with oil and gas. Because the oil and gas that the United States, NATO, Europe, everybody still officially has the policy, has exemptions, has licenses, has this, that, and the other thing, saying that Russia is perfectly free to sell all of its oil and gas. In fact, we want its oil and gas. We want to pay for its oil and gas. There's these exemptions that still exist, but those exemptions are exactly like the exemptions for food and medicine to Iran and to Syria. They exist, but they don't work practically. I'm not even, we want, European and US governments want US oil and gas. Like the Republicans are partially saying, let's cut off Russian oil and gas so we can drive up prices more, so Biden's more fucked in the election. Like that's the calculus they're making. But the US and European governments want Russian oil and gas to keep flowing, but it won't. Because the consequences are so sweeping for countries that do any kind of business with Russia that isn't allowed, that every company is going to make decisions to simply avoid the Russian oil and gas sector. You've already seen that with some trading houses refusing to purchase certain offers of, I'm not exactly sure how the minutiae of that works, offers of Russian oil and gas. If those trading houses don't purchase it, then it simply does not flow on into the broader world oil market. Exxon, I think Exxon, Shell, and is it British Petroleum? Regardless, most large oil and gas companies, despite not yet being required to, I think potentially quietly asked not to, have now pulled out of the Russian market. There are large-scale projects throughout Russia that relied upon U.S. expertise. I mean, the projects are there, they exist, they will continue to bump, but without U.S. experts, things are going to break down. Things are going to break down and not going to get fixed. So oil and gas money is still going to flow to Russia in obscene quantities, but nowhere near at the volume that Europe is hoping. As we saw today, the relentless climb of oil and gas prices. I think it slowed down a little yesterday. It is going to continue. Next week, I would not be surprised if we saw $150 a barrel for oil. And then I think at some point, the Saudis and the rest of OPEC are going to break the OPEC Plus agreement, decide to profit massively. By a month from now, we'll have U.S. shale gas going gangbusters. But yeah, into this summer, we're going to have oil and gas prices over $100 a barrel, for sure. So what that means for Syria is disastrous. Regardless, who knows how the Russia-Ukraine war is going to get. We'll talk about that in a second. But the isolation of Russia is almost certain to continue regardless. Almost certain to continue regardless. And as that continues, more and more is going to break down. there's been some, I think this is sort of an open question, but when I advanced this idea that Syria is about to be in a lot of trouble, folks have pointed, well, oh, no. Actually, Iran's the main country that supports Syria financially. Like maybe the Iranian, of course, the Russian bombers are very important, but it's Iran's financial support that's really important to Syria. But you have to understand that Iran, throughout the past decade, has been a pariah of the same nature that Syria has been. Russia has not been. I've been seeing a lot of stuff indicating that Russia's entire aviation system might be about to break down. Its entire aviation industry, because of the nuances of sort of late neoliberal airplane funding. Most airline fleets, to save money or make money or just create something else that is debt funded and financed, most airplane fleets are owned by different entities, probably Swiss and U.S. entities. Large leasing companies actually own the planes. And a lot of those planes are getting seized, and they will continue to get seized, the planes of Russian airlines, whenever they leave the country. So presumably one of the only air links that Syria had was Aeroflot, was from Russia through Syria. That's probably gone. There's definitely large-scale Russian investment in Syria. I don't, perhaps Iranian investment is more important, but Russian investment was the stuff that could exist legally in the financial system. Iran is not a country for a decade that has been able to exist legally in the financial system. So even if it is Iranian money behind it, Russian, to the extent that Syria had any ability to have any kind of reconstruction, any kind of financial relationship anywhere in the world, this is the Syrian government or regime or whatever, Assad regime, whatever, all of those windows just got closed down. I think it's interesting. The Turkish government, I think they're playing a very dangerous game here, but I think have appropriately judged that Russia isn't interested in creating a conflict with Turkey at this moment. But Turkey is shutting down access to the Black Sea for Russia. And I wouldn't, I would expect this to go back and forth. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if Erdogan came up with reasons why certain ships were allowed to go. I think there's actually some in the actual, was it Montreux Treaty? I think there actually is some language that would allow the Turkish government to essentially let through whatever ships it wanted to let through. I think there's a lot of scope there. But regardless, it has become tremendously more complicated for Russian naval and military assets to even access the Syrian theater of conflict. So while I think it would be a concern, oh gosh, it's interesting. According to some statistics, the Russian military has already lost in Ukraine a number of useful aircraft that is higher than the entire number of Russian aircraft that is probably in Syria. I don't know. Certainly, Russia doesn't have a shortage of aircraft such that it's going to desperately need those 30 to 60 to however Russian planes that are in Syria. But it's important to remember that that equipment in Syria is some of the best performing material. And the logistics and the personnel, I think it's much more likely that the logistics and the personnel are, probably hiking across the Turkish border as we speak to fly commercially into Russia to contribute to the Ukraine war effort. So I think while it's true that elevated oil prices, especially as seems possible if we have the JCPOA by next week, the Iran's return to the Iran nuclear deal and the return of Iran's ability to sell oil and gas, we could actually see Iran become much more flush with money and be able to dump more money into Syria. But really, I think this loss of an air force, Iran does not have an air force to speak of. It has missiles that it can use to destroy targets. It does not have an actual air force with planes and whatnot. I think it's very possible that we're going to go from a situation where we're going to go from a situation that looks like this. Nope, sorry. We're going to go from a situation that looks like this back to more of a situation that looks like this. We're going to have casualties in. We'll have casualties in Syria that'll go back to looking like the 50,000 to 70,000 range a year, rather than 3 to 4,000 a year we have currently. And I think that's absolutely horrific. Another thing to consider is that if Iran were to become the main sponsor of the Syrian regime again, Israel would absolutely flip out. Israel is continually bombing Iranian elements in Syria. And if Iran became again the sort of sole support of the Syrian government, I expect that Israel would step up that bombing campaign with almost zero pushback from the United States. I do think it's worth pointing out that this could also be an opportunity. The main reason the United States had, the main justification, I don't consider it a good reason, the main justification the United States has for remaining in Syria, keeping U.S. troops in Syria, is to defend the Kurds. This is, of course, leaving out the fact that the only reason the Syrian government and the Kurds aren't working together, as they did for the first 5 years of the Syrian civil war, is because the United States is intentionally turning them against each other. However, there have actually been clashes because of the United States between Kurds and the Syrian government, and I do think it is after the U.S. destroyed the relationship, there was a real concern about, well, how would Syria welcome back these Kurds? Well, now that Syria is in serious danger of losing its Russian sponsorship, or rather, it'll never lose Russia's rhetorical sponsorship, but there's in serious danger of losing Russia's high-quality, focused sponsorship. I would imagine the Syrian government is probably in the best position it's been in for 3 years to be forced to make a more advantageous deal with the Kurds, because Syria, wants those fighting forces to fight against the Islamic State jihadist elements and the Turkish government that the Kurds are already fighting. So there is some opportunity here, but I really do think that now is the time to get worried about Syria. I think that the United States should actually be looking honestly for ways to extract itself from that conflict. I think that if Russia has to pull back from this conflict, it would perhaps help to maintain the balance if the United States pulled back from this conflict in a similar way. That is, of course, not what we're doing. We are sanctioning the country hellishly. As I was talking about earlier, sure, we let in humanitarian stuff. And yes, the United Nations can get food in. The basic elements of any other business or individual or country that might want to, I don't know, sell food to Syria as part of the usual course of business cannot do so, or is deterred from doing so. We have maintained those military forces there to make sure that Syria has difficulty renewing its trade relations with Iraq, with Jordan, and of course with Iran. We hold on to our military forces in the Kurdish areas to make sure that the Kurds are not forced to make an accommodation with the Syrian government. If we could pull back from that position, then just maybe the Syrians, with the support of an Arab League that now seems more interested in supporting Assad, could actually begin to reconstruction and could truly crush the Islamic State. But they can't do that while the United States is there. The one point I want to make on Ukraine. I'm sure you're all following Ukraine closely. I hope to have a produced video talking about some of the broader strategic consequences next Tuesday. But as far as following the minutia of the Ukraine conflict, like, I'm not the guy. There are many great experts. I follow a list on Twitter called Anglophone Russia that's got ongoing conflict descriptions, whatnot. I really like Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee, of course, on Twitter. Those are great people to follow for the play-by-play, for the details. I do have one point that I want to make. This map from a week ago, honestly, hasn't changed that much. Just pretty stunning. However, of course, a week later, Russia is further towards its objectives. In the south, I think it's had the most success. It's as the U.S. government came out, I think, this morning or yesterday to say the supply lines for Russia are shortest from Crimea. You know, they can be replenished from the sea, and they have massive military, naval, Air Force elements in Crimea and always have. So the push from the south seems to be the most successful Russian effort thus far. And Kherson, as the way I used to call it, but apparently it's Kherson. The K is silent. Kherson, that southern city, is the first true urban conquest that Russia has attained. Kherson is certainly, I believe, one of the top 10 cities in Ukraine. Is it top 5? I regrettably did not look into that. But Kherson is now acknowledged by, I don't know if it's been acknowledged by the Ukrainian government, but it's certainly been acknowledged by the US and Russian governments to be fully in control of the Russians. This is the first city that they have managed to take 9 days into the conflict. And what happens now? What happens now in Kherson is possibly the most important question in the Ukrainian conflict this weekend. And of course, that question is insurgency. Are we going to see a large-scale insurgency in Kherson? I don't know. We could. Certainly the fierceness and the fervor with which the Ukrainian military has faced down the Russians indicates that there could be a large-scale insurgency. I think the expectations of most of the U.S. foreign policy commentariat, most everybody, are that a massive insurgency against the Russians is almost immediately going to happen. That's where I'm leaning as well. But I think it is interesting. It's the lesson that everybody has in their minds is Iraq and Syria. Is Iraq and the massive insurgency that developed, Iraq and Afghanistan, and the massive insurgencies that developed against the United States. Russians and Ukrainians, to an extent, some Russians and Ukrainians hate each other. But it's stunning, and I think even huge supporters of Ukraine would admit this. It is stunning to the extent to which, I'm not minimizing at all the very real roots of the separate Ukrainian language, people, history, etc. But I think even the big Ukraine supporters would acknowledge the extent to which Ukrainian identity, this idea that Ukrainians are a separate people that should be separate from Russia, has really only attained mass support within Ukraine over the past 8 years of Putin's invasions. This is a relatively novel thing. And it is key to emphasize that a lot of the Russian lack of success with their first shock and awe attempts was down to the fact that they were, up until really the past couple days, very unwilling to bomb their Ukrainian brothers and the civilians. They were unwilling to do the extent of terror bombing that they're happy to do. They were happy to do in Chechnya, and that they were happy to do in Syria. That's changing, of course. But now that Russia holds Kherson,
There's some interesting footage of Ukrainian folks waving flags in the faces of Russian soldiers, essentially daring them to shoot, essentially daring them to arrest them, get them in trouble. And it's this fairly interesting dynamic for the Russians right now is that it is in their interest to set up as friendly as possible and as open as possible administration over Kherson. If they start shooting folks who wave Ukrainian flags in their faces, they're going to get an insurgency, no question. It's definitely in the interest of the Ukrainian government and NATO intelligence agencies to inspire Russian brutality, because that Russian brutality is maybe necessary to spark a truly in-depth insurgency. So this is the vital question of the weekend. How does Russia take Kherson? How do we react to that? How do the Ukrainians react to how the Russians take Kherson? Is it possible? The Russians, of course, still believe it's possible that if they attain control and put themselves in power over a part of Ukraine, then even folks who might be angry about it, they'll just sort of grin and bear it and go about their daily lives in the name of peace. Is that what's going to happen? I don't think so. So that's why Kherson, the first Ukrainian city taken by the Russians, is tremendously important. It really is the indicator of it is the early indicator of how intense the insurgency is going to be. It's entirely possible, I think in Iraq, the insurgency took a little while to get going. It's entirely possible that we'll see nothing that looks like an insurgency in Kherson over the next week. But then maybe the Russians will kill Zelensky, or there'll be some other, maybe they'll set another nuclear plant on fire. Or there will be some kind of other tremendous info war loss for the Russians, and that will spark a more serious insurgency. So I think that's the really key question right now. I think it's becoming clearer with the taking of Kherson, and we'll probably get a really depressing siege of Kyiv next week. It's entirely possible that Zelensky could capitulate, but I don't think there's enough. I don't think there's enough overlap at this point between what Putin wants and what the Ukrainians want. I think we're going to see the Russian military, the scale of the Russian military, begin to bear down and start to. I'm not sure if we're going to get an amphibious invasion of Odessa. Anyway, I'm falling into speculation that I've proved myself to not be any good at. So I'm just going to stop doing that, and we're going to. Funnel says Noah Smith is the chief Russia-Ukraine expert I follow on Twitter. That makes me very sad. Anyway, okay, it's time for Q&A. I'm gonna answer questions. I noticed there was a super chat from Mike No-Go Zone, so I will start there. Mike No-Go Zone says, thanks for covering Syria. As one of the few Americans who has visited and filmed there, I have strong feelings for the Syrian people. Yeah, it's important to emphasize that the vast majority of the Syrian people have always lived under the Assad government. It's not like in 2016 with that really nasty map that led to an incredible amount of death. The majority of Syrians have lived on the coast. I guess the coast of Lebanon, but the Syria has a little bit of coastline, and then Lebanon was carved out by the French. But the majority of Syrians have lived always in the territory that the Assad government has controlled. The Assad regime-controlled areas have always been vastly better places to live than the rebel-controlled areas, almost all of which ended up controlled. I think, is it almost all of which or all of which? Maybe there were some territories in the south that had Jordanian support that were less horrifying. But yeah, if you want to grab a beer, you want to, talk to a woman whose facial features you can identify, or whose hair you can see. Syria was always the Assad regime controlled Syria was always where you wanted to be. Nasty political dictatorship, but the sort of totalitarian jihadist interpretations of life under the rebels everywhere were much less pleasant. And you can see that today in Idlib, if you can go to Idlib without getting your head cut off. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you for that super chat, Mike No Go Zones. Yes, I always answer super chat questions. Local Cool Extreme asks, will these current oil price hikes be enough to save the Saudis? No, I would say no. I think that the key thing with today's oil prices, and I think something that people are keeping in mind, is that despite all the excitement, is that this is a really brief return to higher oil prices. This is a brief comeback to the oil prices of now we're not just getting into 2014 territory. I haven't needed to look at anything earlier than 2014 for the past 8 years, because oil prices never got anywhere near as high as they were in 2014. We are now past 2014. I'm not sure if we're getting back to 2007, 2008. I think those were the highest oil prices we had ever seen. But we're comfortably back beyond 2014 prices now. We're, I think, in the 110. I can Google that right now. We are in, up 4% today. Yeah. Brent and WTI, the Texas, the U.S. oil price is at $112 a barrel. Brent is at $114 a barrel. That's up 3 and 4% today. That's only going to go higher. I think we could see 150. What's important about that for Saudi purposes, I feel like I've answered this question before in a live chat, but I'll try and be brief with it. What's important from Saudi purposes is that they have 8 years of not making enough money from oil and gas to make up for. 8 freaking years. And 2 months or 3 months or 6 months is not going to make up for it. If we stayed at $150 for a barrel of oil, if we stayed at that price that I believe will hit in the next couple of weeks, if we stayed there for a year, yeah, okay, yeah, then we're talking about Saudi Arabia being able to pay off the debts it's accrued over the past 8 to 10 years, pay off all of the businesses it's stiffed over the past 8 years, bring in enough social spending to make their public happy again. Yeah, if we get $150 barrel of oil for a year, then like my central prediction of Saudi Arabia being done by 2030, I will have been wrong and will concede the point. But we're not going to get $150 a barrel for a year. At those kinds of prices, the kinds of prices that would be necessary to make Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family governed Saudi Arabia, sustainable for the long term, those kinds of oil prices just destroy demand. When oil prices are that high, sure, the United States is going to continue. People in the United States will change their behavior. My mom just bought an electric car. I think she was interested in doing that before this, but I think we saw U.S. sales of electric cars double in 2021, and we will see them double again if we have, for every 6-month period when we have $150 barrel in oil, we'll see electric car purchases in the United States double again. We'll find the lithium somewhere. We'll find the nickel somewhere. But even before electric vehicles came into the mix, you had real demand destruction. India just simply chooses not to buy oil and gas, or rather, actors within the Indian economy, one of the biggest markets for oil and gas now, simply make choices not to consume oil and gas at those prices. So like the kinds of prices here, the kinds of prices that Saudi Arabia would need to be saved to make up for the past 8 years of bargain basement oil prices, though the oil prices that Saudi Arabia would need are simply unsustainable. They just won't happen. Osama Lasfer says, "What do you think about racism in the train station in Ukraine?" I think it's appalling. I think there's no question that Eastern or Central Europeans, actually, we're talking about their racism, so fuck them. Let's call them Eastern Europeans. I hate that. Eastern Europeans are super racist. I mean, most Europeans are super racist. Everybody's super racist. But Eastern Europeans are to a high degree quite, have not been exposed to many people of color and believe that it's okay to treat them like dirt. And we've seen a lot of this over the past week. You've got large-scale refugee flows, and it's not just the Ukrainians. It's the Poles, it's the Romanians who have been doing this as well. There was a Twitter thread, I think I retweeted, talking about this poor woman who I think might have actually been adopted into a different family, a family from a different background, but I think was Cote d'Ivoire, some African country, clearly a black African woman, and just a horrific, every step of her attempt to leave Ukraine was blocked by racism. Ukrainians, refusing to let non-Ukrainians onto buses, arriving in Poland, and the Polish border folks saying, "Okay, every black person has to get off this bus and go into a little camp, and we'll let the Ukrainians go and try and find a hotel or a church basement to stay in Warsaw." It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling. There's no excuses that can possibly be made for it. Personally, my experience in Ukraine, which has certainly made me unsympathetic to them, helped a great deal by the election of Zelensky. I visited. Is it Lviv or Lvov? I don't know what the appropriate Ukrainian pronunciation is. Is it Lviv because it's Kiev? Anyway. Lviv. I visited Lviv and went and saw this beautiful, horrifying, very moving monument to a synagogue that had been burned down by the Nazis. And you just sort of, wow, this is a really powerful place. It's a monument, and right next to it they had an actual anti-Semitism theme restaurant where you could buy caricatures of Jews and. It was one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen in my life. The minimization of right-wing neo-Nazi elements in the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian political scene is extraordinarily dishonest in the United States. The United States, it's true, Ukraine totally has a Jewish president, and that's amazing. The United States had a black president for 8 years. Does anybody think there's no racism in the United States? Now, all of that said, Ukraine has terrible problems with race. Eastern Europe has terrible problems with race. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. It should be embarrassing for the Polish and Ukrainian governments. They should be doing everything they can to avoid that nightmarish fact and nightmarish InfoWar loss of that. But regardless, Ukraine is being invaded by its neighbor. I don't give a shit if their whole fighting force is Nazis. I would give a shit if they were the whole fighting force was actually Nazis. But the fact that there's some nasty right-wing elements, there are some racists in this Eastern European country, as there are in all of the Eastern European countries that are in NATO, are kind of racist. I don't care. I don't give a shit. This is exactly the same way that I feel about Yemen. Yemen is a country that has a indigenous resistance force called the Houthis that is awful, that is anti-Semitic, that is not just nasty in the way that it talks about the United States and Israel and Jews in general. It's nasty to the people in Yemen that don't agree with them. It's North Yemen, certainly the territory that the Houthis control, I believe, is a plurality Zaydi Shia, but there's tons of Sunnis that they control, and they're very disrespectful to the Sunnis that they control. That's terrible. That's bad. The Houthis are sectarian. They are anti-Semitic. They are somewhat totalitarian. They're really, really nasty, and I don't give a shit because they are an indigenous resistance movement facing off against a foreign invader. And no matter how nasty, no matter how nasty a country is or an element of a country is, if they are being invaded by their neighbor, it is the duty of all decent human beings to support that country in throwing out the invader. I feel the same way about the Azov battalion or other right-wing anti-Semitic elements within Ukraine as I feel about the Houthis in Yemen. Yes, it's bad. We should call it out. We should make clear what's terrible about, these elements of Ukraine and Yemen. But we should never, ever, ever allow that to translate into support for an outside invader. That's just, to be racist is bad, but to invade your weaker neighbor is infinitely worse. The reason we hate the Nazis, what makes a Nazi, it's become in popular culture mostly because the United States doesn't want to think about why Nazis are initially hated. It's become about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. But what made the Nazis so incredibly loathsome was their assumption that they could just invade their neighbors, that they could just go into other countries and take everything for themselves. And that's the assumption that Russia makes in Ukraine. That's the most Nazi-like behavior we've seen. I've made videos talking about how you shouldn't compare Putin to Hitler. This is when you start comparing Russia to Nazi Germany, when they invade their neighbors and take what they want. This is when you start comparing Saudi Arabia to Nazi Germany, is when they invade their neighbors to take what they want. Of course, the Saudis are really bad at it, so they invaded their neighbors, and the UAE ended up taking what it wanted. But that's a different story. Not so many super chats today, huh? Well, I've been doing a lot of live lately, so perhaps I've super chatted folks out a little. Andre Debia, apologies if I mispronounced that, says, "Hey, I really enjoy your work. Do you think Belarus will send troops into Ukraine? Also, I'm from Romania, and the only racism I've seen is against gypsies." Well, the only racism you've seen in Romania is against gypsies because that's the only non-Romanians who are there, right? In large numbers, anyway. I'm sure there are, Romania has some competent universities that have folks from all over the world, but I'm sure if you asked those folks who are from all over the world, they might have a slightly different approach to how racially tolerant Romania is than Romanians might be. But anyway, thank you for the super chat. I don't want to be insulting, but yeah, I think possibly your sense of how racist Romania might be is different. Just as my sense of how racist my country, the United States, is fairly high. But I'm never going to have as intimate an understanding of that as the African American gentleman walking down the street outside. Do I think Belarus will send troops into Ukraine? I think that would be dumb. I think that would be a terrible escalation. I think that would be Belarus declaring war on Ukraine, which I think would be bad for the Belarusian people, even potentially bad for Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus. Honestly, I don't see how that's going to be super useful for Russia at this point. I think Russia's challenge is coordination. They have the personnel, they have the manpower, they have the material. The main problem, again, I don't want to trend into military analysis because I've gotten it so wrong recently, but my understanding is that they have the manpower, they have the what's the word I'm looking for here? They have the stuff. They have what they need to fight a war. The Russian military has what they need to fight a war in Ukraine and win a war in Ukraine. The problem thus far has been coordination and logistics. Throwing the Belarusian military in there, presumably a military that's mostly good at crushing Lukashenko's any threats to Lukashenko, has never, I would assume, Russia, to the extent that it has influence, which I believe is large, has worked to make sure it's not a very competent fighting force. The idea of throwing a bunch of Belarusian divisions into the already nightmarishly screwed up, nightmarishly FUBAR, it's a classic World War II term, FUBAR, fucked up beyond all recognition, logistical picture for the Russians, I don't think the Belarusians would actually be helpful. If we do see Belarusians sent into the war in Ukraine, that might be an indication that Russia's military situation is truly dire, and they may be running out of personnel and cannon fodder. That's my sense. I've seen some reports of Belarusian troops in Ukraine, the United States. I think I remember just there was some review. Secondhand, of course, off of Twitter, but I think it was from a respected journalist that Belarusian troops are definitely not yet in Ukraine. But yeah, I'd say if Belarusian troops went into Ukraine in force, that would be a bad sign for the Russian war effort. Stalin invaded his neighbors. Why isn't Vlad juxtaposed against Stalin? Did Stalin invade his neighbors? Yes, he certainly, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed an accord with the Nazis to divide up Poland. So, and he invaded Finland, I guess. But yeah, I see Stalin. I get a little irritated by this, like, Stalin was just as bad as Hitler. Like, Hitler killed as many Russians as Stalin did. You fucking know that, right? Like, I feel like it's this really never challenged bit of information that everybody knows that's simply not true. Like Bill Burr, he's a comedian, I think, has a big shtick talking about Stalin was just as bad as Hitler. Like, Hitler, in 4 years, killed as many Russians as Stalin did in 25? Like, yeah, this whole, like, I mean, Stalin sucks. Like, I'm not here to defend Stalin. Stalin's a piece of shit. Stalin was a madman, a dictator, a nightmare person, certainly in the same circle of hell as Hitler and, Hitler and Mao or whatever. But, like, this idea that Stalin was just as bad as Hitler is simply incorrect, like, on every metric. It's just wrong. So yeah, I think that the reason, but I mean, from a simple propagandist perspective, James, like the idea that why Stalin, why is Vlad not juxtaposed against Stalin? Because I think, as has been trumpeted in U.S. Media for about a decade now, over the past decade, Stalin's image has been improving in Russia. In Russia, people aren't as embarrassed of Stalin as they used to be. So I don't think Vlad would be at all insulted to be called Stalin. I mean, he probably would be, to an extent. Let's not overstate things here. But Vlad would certainly be more insulted to be called a Nazi. So let's call him a Nazi, which is fair. I mean, invasion is what makes a Nazi. Invasion is what made the Nazis so incredibly horrific. It's only the past, really 30 years of the United States being super excited to do invasions that have had that element of Nazi horror been de-emphasized. And we now focus just on the genocide and anti-Semitism, which is, of course, horrific things that the Nazis did, but That's not, in fact, they were able to do the final solution. They were able to do genocide on the scale that they did because they invaded other countries. I think a much higher proportion of German Jews were able to escape than the Polish Jews, the Greek Jews, the Yugoslavian Jews, the Russian Jews that were slaughtered in much, much higher numbers. It's the conquest that made Hitler as evil as he was and allowed him to commit the horrors of the Holocaust. But we don't want to talk about the conquest that Hitler did in the United States anymore because we've decided that conquest is virtuous. It's not. Federico Bruzon says, "Father, hopefully it'll be..." Okay, that's not a question for me. Do we have questions? Danny Yegg, that's a question. Do you think this invasion has accelerated the pace of the Iran nuclear talks? Unquestionably. I think there was a lot of talk that I hadn't had much faith in throughout the beginning of this year about progress on the JCPOA talks. A lot of talk about that throughout this year that I've found tantalizing, but also, well, I hear about this progress all the time. But yeah, unquestionably, the U.S. has almost certainly gotten more open to the JCPOA as the oil prices have mounted. And now that Russia has invaded, I think we've got to be thinking, and we're talking about, I'll talk about this a little on Tuesday, hopefully. Now that we're talking about like real reformatting of the world order, I would hope that the United States is like, wait a second, like, why are we so pissed off at the Iranians? They don't invade anybody. Russia just started a fucking shooting war in Europe, and I think that's a lot higher priority than Iranian, I don't know. The main thing that matters for the United States relative to Iran is Iran not getting a nuclear bomb. I 100% believe that. And we've got an agreement right here that Iran is eager to jump back into that involves keeping them from a nuclear bomb. The reason we destroyed the JCPOA was just standard U.S. wanting to fight with everybody all the time. The main reason that elements in Washington, D.C. killed the JCPOA because it threatened peace. It didn't threaten peace, it threatened war. It threatened Washington, D.C. with the possibility of real peace and diplomacy with Iran. So yeah, absolutely. Denny, to answer your question, yes, I think this invasion and the fact that this invasion was something that we've been building up to for months. It's not just the actual invasion, it's the fact that Russia has been so, what's the word I'm looking for? Russia has been so aggressive for like 2 months now, and that absolutely the broader thing, not just the actual invasion, has put more impetus behind the JCPOA talks from the U.S. Daxton Min, will Russia make a military move on other Eastern European countries if they are successful in Ukraine, or will they stop there? They'll stop in Ukraine. Well, that's okay. So Belarus, they've taken basically. Belarus is host to host to Russian military forces. That's largely accomplished, I think. And the Baltics have got to be pretty pissed off about that. And Poland's got to be pretty pissed off about that. And so, Jesus, I'm embarrassed. So does Russia now have a land bridge to Kaliningrad? No, it doesn't. It just doesn't. So Kaliningrad is that weird little Russian nub on the Baltic that is blocked, used to be blocked. Russia used to have Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus blocking its path to Kaliningrad. Now it just has Poland and Lithuania because Belarus now seems to be in the process of being wrapped back into Russia. If you call up Belarus on a map, this makes Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia feel a lot more isolated, which is no bueno, but it's something that's essentially already done. If you look to the west of Odessa, southern Ukraine. You've got Moldova, which is a tiny country that is to some extent already occupied by Russian forces, have been for 30 years. They just never left, in a sort of breakaway republic called Transdniestra. I think that if Putin's conquest of Ukraine had been as successful as he'd hoped, a quick walk in the park, he's sort of taken over the whole Black Sea region, then absolutely Moldova would be in very serious danger. Moldova, I think we probably should be talking a little bit more, as we see Russian forces have taken Kherson, are attempting to take Mykolaiv, and are threatening Odessa. We probably should be a little more worried about Moldova. So yeah, I don't want to say there's no chance, but Belarus is about 10 million people. Moldova is about 3 million people, and that's as far as Russia could possibly go. Russia will not invade NATO. And I'm not really concerned about.
So yeah, I don't want to say there's no chance.
Sorry. And I'm not really concerned about being proved wrong if Russia invades NATO, because if Russia invades NATO, that's the end of human civilization. That's guaranteed World War III. The United States is committed through Article 5 to defend all NATO countries, and we will do so. It won't be automatic World War III. There'll be a day or two of really scary, really sad conventional warfare that will probably involve the United States and NATO just absolutely wiping out Russian forces, and then Russia launching nukes, and then the U.S. launching nukes, and the end of civilization. And I think that Russia knows that. So we're not going to see. So we're not going to see large-scale invasions of a NATO country. And I've said this before, there's nothing that the U.S. government cares about more, no higher or better purpose, highest and best use, no higher or better purpose for the for the U.S. military, the U.S. government, than selling weapons. And NATO is the golden goose, is the best way for the U.S. to sell weapons abroad. If we were to not defend Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, then we would lose our ability to sell weapons. So that's a guaranteed end of human civilization if Russia invades another NATO country beyond Moldova or Belarus. From Atik Farukin, in your opinion, to what degree is Russian insecurity resulting from the expansion of NATO response for the situation? I would say, Russia, I would say 100%, 90 to 100%. It's both. It's not but also obviously Russia and Putin bears responsibility for what they fucking do. I think the element of time is really important here. And I think what people keep assuming that pisses me off is that that a hyper-aggressive, hyper-nationalist Vladimir Putin's Russia is inevitable. It was never inevitable. Even a hyper-nationalist, hyper-aggressive Vladimir Putin was never inevitable. That didn't happen until 2008. We had a solid 18 years in which Russia could have been a better, a better participant in the world system, a unaggressive country that was not interested in conquest and imperialism. We have warped Vladimir Putin into a dramatically more hyper-nationalist, nasty figure. There's all manner of sort of Putinology, talking about, going through his writings and his speeches and the things that he's said and what his feelings must be. But you got to understand that the dominant feature in Putin's psychology is the United States, or the West more broadly, is this enemy that he's built up for himself, that he has to defend the Russian or Slavic or peoples from. And the United States, at every step of the way, has reacted to Russian attempts to reach out, attempts to be a better, citizen attempts to fully join the world system on a peaceful basis with military aggression. NATO is a military organization. NATO's a defensive organization. NATO is an empire it is a militarized empire that has spread further and faster than any empire since any country, any state organization since the 19th century. The European Union is comparable, but it's not military. NATO is military. It is fundamentally military. Fundamentally military, and it is hyper expansive. It has, after we promised, this is a controversial point, but I think it's largely been proven to my satisfaction. After we promised Gorbachev that we would not expand NATO beyond Germany, we broke that promise, and we pissed in Russia's face for 30 fucking years. Russia is not excused. It is not allowable that Russia reacted in the way that it did with such hideous violence. That is not okay. That'll never be okay. That's not something that we should make apologies for. But 100%, the position of Vladimir Putin and the poor decisions that he made, the fact that he's even still in power, 100% is the result of NATO expansion. There's not a doubt in my mind. And the fact that we've finally gotten to the war in Europe that NATO always wanted doesn't detract from that. Yeah, this NATO's a defensive organization. It's a military empire. It's a better marketed military empire than the clownish nightmare that Russia is offering. It's a almost infinitely more wealthy military empire. I mean, the extraordinary thing that Russia remains entirely dependent on NATO EU money to do anything. But yeah, like it's a militarized empire, and that's the thing. It just wasn't necessary. I think a lot of people have looked over the past. Of course, everybody confirms their priors when things happen, and I think the very common way of looking at what's happened to Ukraine is, oh, thank God the Baltics are in NATO. Thank God Poland and Hungary are in NATO, because otherwise this Russian juggernaut would have just rolled over them. And it's like, well, actually, like, is that Russian military over the past 9 days look impressive to you? Doesn't look very impressive to me. And it's fundamentally a militarized empire. The Russian Empire is one that is lost and lost miserably. There's a new Iron Curtain in Europe, and it's what, 1,000 miles, no, 500 miles further towards the east than it used to be. It's a goddamn tragedy. And yes, I think as the infinitely more powerful actor here, NATO deserves the majority of the blame. Of course, it's Russian figures that are going to end up being accused of war crimes and prosecuted, hopefully, and this and the other thing. Yeah, it's NATO that made this happen. Questions. Sorry, I can't understand that Arabic name. More Freedom Foundation. What do you think about Ukrainian Jews building illegal settlements in Palestine? I mean, I've been even when I was a hyper Zionist Israel supporter in my 20s, I thought that settlements were a terrible idea, and I continue believing that. Unfortunately, I no longer believe that Israel will be dissuaded from doing those sorts of things, which just makes me very sad. Yeah, if you want to know more about my Israel-Palestine views, which are very depressing, I did a 2-hour, it was an hour-long presentation and a 2-hour live chat like this about back the last time Israel was slaughtering Palestinians in large numbers. Was it May of 2021? Called How Israel No Longer Needs the U.S. or something like that. Yeah, just Google More Freedom Foundation Israel, it'll come up. and I talk about it at length, and I don't want to talk about that issue anymore. Um, will NATO continue to expand further after recent events? I don't think we should expand to Georgia, Moldova, or Ukraine. They're countries that are occupied to some degree, and they don't offer much. I think Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, not Georgia, let's be honest, not Georgia, but I think Moldova and Ukraine should absolutely be added to the European Union. If you're talking about a club that presents the solidarity of Europe in a way that is not as threatening to Russia, it is the European Union. It's not NATO that made Poland or Estonia or Lithuania wealthy enough that they could plausibly resist Russia. It was the European Union. It was the institutions, the money, the so much frickin' free money that you get when you join the EU. That's what made the Baltics and Poland more resilient. The Baltics, this military we've seen in Russia, I actually kind of believe. I've always believed that Poland would beat the shit out of Russia if Russia tried to invade Poland all by itself. I don't yet believe that about the Baltics, though with the poor performance of the Russian military recently, I do believe that. But the fact that the Baltics, places with high Russian minorities, that those Russians would prefer to be part of the Baltics than to be in Russia, and prefer to be a part of Europe rather than Russia, that's about the EU. That's not about fucking NATO. NATO didn't provide that security. So I absolutely advocate Moldova and Ukraine joining the EU. Maybe Georgia after Turkey joins. I think that would just be so insulting to Turkey to start adding like Georgia and Armenia and probably not Azerbaijan before Turkey got added. But yeah, I think Ukraine and Moldova should absolutely be joining the EU as soon as humanly possible. Sweden and Finland, I would have said on February 20th. When did that invasion start? 23rd, 27th? I can't remember. On February 20th, I would have said that Sweden and Finland joining NATO would be an incredibly insulting thing to Russia, and it shouldn't happen. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 100%, Sweden and Finland should join NATO. That is one of many ways that Russia should be punished. 100%. And also Sweden and Finland, as demonstrated by the fact that Finland purchased $10 billion of U.S. weapons, has demonstrated that it is actually capable of contributing to U.S. security. Is actually a ally that does not guarantee a war with Russia, as adding Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova would. But I guarantee a war with Russia, as adding one of those countries would. Sweden and Finland actually add to the NATO package, and there's no. I have no sympathy for Russia's anger at Sweden and Finland joining NATO anymore. So yeah, it should happen. Let's see. I think there's a number of super chats I've missed here. Fada. If the U.S. had stayed out of MENA in the 1990s, Libya and Iraq would be developed, industrialized countries today. The rest of the world would be developing as well. I think that's true, honestly. But of course, that would also require, Fadel, that the U.S. didn't just stay out of Middle East and North Africa in the 90s, but also was willing to allow our old support for but was also willing to allow our support, our Gaddafi throughout the 70s and certainly in the 80s, I think was his big deal, was like the scary enemy, like the main motivation for U.S. defense budgets, or one of them. He was the scary terrorist mastermind, and Saddam Hussein certainly occupied that role in the 90s. And the U.S. So I think you'd have to say that the U.S. wouldn't just have had to have stayed out of the Middle East and North Africa, would have also not sanctioned Libya and Iraq. But yeah, for sure. And the thing that always just kills me is that in 2010, Turkey had this rampaging economy, like 10% growth, as part of its Zero Problems with Neighbors program. It created a sort of customs union, or I don't know, it was free passage with perhaps in part because it was angry at the European Union for not letting that happen. But free movement of people with Syria, Lebanon, was it Iraq too? It might have even been Iraq as well, and Turkey, creating this economic bloc with like 10% growth. It was there, like it was there. It was just you could have touched it, like. Istanbul would have been as Syrian a city as it is today, but it would have been people who moved there voluntarily to get into massive factories that the Turks had built, and the whole region would have been so much happier if the United States and Turkey hadn't decided to use the Arab Spring as an opportunity to murder Syria. So close. Yeah, so you don't even have to go back to the 90s, Fadel, to talk about like missed opportunities. Such a goddamn shame. Snagman Ultra, I answered that. Jack Hawkins, I answered that. Christopher Murtaugh, if Russians will actively attack a nuclear power plant, isn't this essentially triggering World War III? Shouldn't NATO do what it can to prevent? So no. There's a strong distinction between nuclear power plants as territory to be taken. I certainly agree that Russia's shelling of aspects of that plant last night is incredibly irresponsible, but it's not triggering World War III. Chernobyl, absolutely horrific. The meltdown, the near meltdown, or was it an actual? I think it was an actual sort of meltdown that had to be recovered from of the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine, what was then the Soviet Union is now Ukraine in 1986. One of the worst catastrophes, nuclear catastrophes known to man. The discharge of a single nuclear weapon, I think, I'm not 100% on this, but I'm pretty sure would have been infinitely worse than what Chernobyl did to all of Northern Europe, to all of Europe, really. Would have been so a single nuclear weapon detonation would, of course, instantly kill hundreds of thousands. Keep in mind that these things, I think the average nuclear weapon is 10 times more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima nowadays. It would instantly kill hundreds of thousands and create fallout that didn't, the fallout from a nuclear weapon discharge. It is horrific that Ukraine had the Chernobyl incident in 1986 has had, I saw a commentator at Respect talking about how she has thyroid issues, most probably because of that, because of being a kid in Europe, in Northern Europe in the 80s. Cancer rates elevated everywhere. A single nuclear weapon going off would create lethal fallout. And in the event of World War III, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of missiles dropping. And lethal fallout that just simply wipes out human life. Doesn't elevate cancer rates, doesn't... it's actually kind of surprising if you look into the Chernobyl disaster, how few people it directly killed. It could have been, as I think dramatized and accurately dramatized in the recent HBO series on Chernobyl. It could have been infinitely worse. It would have been terribly horrible. The shelling around the nuclear plant, as many have pointed out, those nuclear plants are designed to withstand a full 747 crashing into them. And the Zaporizhzhia, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that. The nuclear plant in Ukraine was not in as much danger. It was certainly something we should all be terrified of, but it was not in danger of melting down or exploding, and it seems to be safely under the control of, unfortunately, the Russians. But no, so Christopher Murtaugh, no, I would not agree that taking a nuclear plant, however irresponsible that may be, that is not triggering World War III. And I think that nuclear plant is either safely operating or safely shut down and controlled by the Russians as we speak. Why shouldn't Georgia be added? It's got two breakaway republics, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, under Russian protection. Those unrecognized republics are essentially in a state of war with Georgia right now, and their recognition by Russia means, and I believe Russia's, I don't know if it's formal, but certainly informal commitment to defend them would mean automatic war with Russia. So yeah, if Georgia joined NATO, we would already be in a state of war with Russia, which is still the case with Ukraine today. If Ukraine joined, obviously today, if Ukraine joined NATO, we would automatically be in a state of war with Russia. We would automatically be in World War III. Was there another? I think it was another. Oh, it was another Christopher Murtaugh super chat. Thank you. Love that the EU is welcoming Ukrainian refugees. Isn't it a shame they weren't as welcoming for Syrians facing the same or worse horrors? 100% on that. Christopher Murtaugh, I did speak at length about the truly nasty stuff that's going on at the Ukrainian, Polish, Romanian borders, where people of color are being singled out and, in some cases, refused entry to these countries and being left to, fix fires for themselves if they can, while Ukrainians are lovingly welcomed as refugees. So that's not just something that, not just a horrific double standard over the course of 5 years, it's a horrific double standard that's occurring right now. Yeah, it's interesting. I think probably the Germans are, and even the Canadians actually, is a little, very, very eager. Canadians, of course, have been really great compared to the United States, have been really great on Syrian refugees. But yeah, they were very quick to be like, bring us all the Ukrainians. Countries like Canada and Germany very intelligently have a very high interest in getting as many working age people as possible into their countries. And I wouldn't be surprised if Germans, and honestly, so do the Hungarians and the Polish and the Romanians. My God, I mean, the Romania and Bulgaria are to some extent depopulated by most of their working age folks going to Western Europe. So yeah, I think there's a lot of Central European countries that are super psyched to have access to a whole bunch of new labor that's also white and Christian. And that's pretty gross, but that's Europe. That's Europe. It was True Realist. For some reason, I always miss your super chats. Thank you. Any changes to Libya, if any? Less Wagner. I mean, Fadel could speak to that in the chat better than I can, True Realist. But that's a great question, actually. Maybe I should do another live chat on what this means for Libya, but I'd have to do further research. My sense on just sort of, so I did a whole almost hour-long presentation talking about the impact that Russia leaving Syria had, that Russia potentially leaving Syria could have. I think that these countries occupy very different positions in different conflicts. And I don't see Russia as central to Libya conflict. I think that I can hear Fadel typing, that Russia is one of the main crutches of Wagner mercenaries, Russian mercenaries are one of the main crutches of the Haftar regime in the east, very much one of the worst actors in Libya. And if Russia pulled back, that'd be great. But I think what's important to emphasize there is why I believe there's some diplomatic cover for Russia. Russia might provide for Libya nominally, positive about Haftar. the Wagner mercenaries in Libya are paid to be there, aren't they? And they're predominantly paid by the UAE. The UAE can find Colombians or South Africans to replace those Wagner mercenaries. So I'm not 100% sure that, I mean, the Russian role is absolutely significant in Libya, but it's significantly smaller than the role of than the role that Russia plays in Libya. There's this comparative thing I think came up in a comment or a tweet that I thought was worth pointing out. Folks are like, why are you so positive about Russia's Russia's intervention in Syria or Turkey's intervention in Libya, both of which I'm very positive about. But you're so negative about Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen, and it's actually quite straightforward. It's because they worked. Because Russia's intervention in Syria brought peace. Turkey's intervention in Libya really, hasn't brought a functioning governing system yet, but it brought peace. Saudi Arabia and the UAE's intervention in Yemen has brought horror, destruction, and starvation for 8 years. Only 7 years now. So yeah, I think it's a pretty simple reason there. Oh gosh, 2 more super chats. Adam of Good says, enjoy a coffee. Well, thank you, Adam of Good. That's very grateful. You don't have any questions? Let me know. Okay. If you had to put odds on NATO sending some troops into Ukraine or doing the no-fly zone, at this point, what's your guess? 0%. 0%. I think it's really instructive recently. So there's a lot of people in U.S. U.S. media, U.S. politics, who build their whole identity around starting wars, around getting the United States involved in wars. They want the U.S. in more wars all the time. These are entities like the Atlantic Council, like was it CNES, was it Center for New American Security, the Brookings Institution, the American Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute. Most think tanks in Washington, D.C., most Republican senators, their whole personality, their whole identity is like, more war, more war. Give more money to these organizations that give me money. Because, of course, defense companies fund all the think tanks in Washington, D.C. The Pentagon funds a lot of think tanks and universities. Republicans, Republican senators, one of the many entities that'll give them jobs when they're no longer senators is defense contractors. Nikki Haley is a really obvious example of that. So yeah, they want more war. And even Ted Cruz, even the Atlantic Council, even the American Enterprise Institute, all of these people, because there are certain folks who just don't understand the world very much, who are like, yeah, let's do a no-fly zone. And all of these hyper-war people, Ted Cruz, the Atlantic Council, everybody from the Atlantic Council, like, whoa, 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 buddy. Because they understand that a no-fly zone, that NATO involvement, sending some troops into Ukraine, is automatic World War III, automatic annihilation of human civilization. I mean, maybe not automatic, maybe that overstates a little bit. Maybe it's only like an 80% chance of the annihilation of human civilization. So no, I don't think NATO's sending any troops to Ukraine and will not be doing the no-fly zone. If I had to put odds, I would say the odds are 0. Actually, I don't need, how does one put odds? It's like 1,000,000 to 1 on NATO sending some troops into Ukraine. Except I don't think that one is very likely. That's my guess, MK. Sorry, I mean, that's a great super chat. I feel like I should say more about that, but yeah, no, I'm pretty definitive. Yeah. Let's see, we're down to the last 5 minutes. Jesus, I guess it's time to start spieling. I should answer a TikTok question. Well, Pricks, I highly appreciate your opinion on this. Is the invasion of Iraq by the U.S. a war crime? Yeah, of course. The invasion of Iraq was definitely a war crime, 100%. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is poor man's George W. Bushing, is what he's doing. I think that's the most instructive. Putin is Hitler, Putin is MBS, who's doing Saudi. But no, mostly what Putin is George W. Bush. What's so contemptible about what Putin has done, this invasion of another country, of a sovereign country, for no good reason. He's got more reason than Iraq than George W. Bush did. I mean, Iraq was on the other side of the world, threatened the United States not at all. Ukraine, the expansion of NATO to Ukraine, like certainly doesn't justify what Putin did, but it's a much more plausible justification than anything that George W. Bush had to offer, other than the Saudis did this horrible thing to us on 9/11, and we have to kill some Arabs, but we want to keep taking money from the Saudis, so let's go with Iraq. Putin's objections to a military alliance being spread to Ukraine, it's a better justification than anything George W. Bush had. Of course, it was a war crime, and of course, nobody's ever going to do anything about that. Saro Pulsaro, thank you. This is generous. Oh man, gosh, the super chats keep rolling in. Did I answer all the ones before Star Pulsar? Let me make sure I did that. And I did that. Star Pulsar, let's say Russia gets exactly what it wants, whether it's a Ukrainian puppet or government or annexation, etc. What does it plan to do next? Try desperately to figure out how to sell oil and gas? Deal with the fact that it's become a sort of utterly loathed Chinese satellite state, like the stands. I don't see. That's the thing. Like I don't see a success case here. I think that if everything had gone exactly as planned in Ukraine, that maybe they'd have pushed on to Moldova, but that would have been it, and they would have dealt with this level of sanctions regardless. I think Putin believes his own press a little bit too much. Believed that I don't think Putin ever believed that Europe would get this unified and this angry at him. I don't believe. I just don't. I don't see a positive way out of this. I just don't see a positive way out of this for Putin and Russia. Yeah, I don't know what they're planning next, and I can't really. Yeah, if they actually had a real military, like, yeah, I think Putin and Xi Jinping just believed a little too much U.S. press, a little too much right-wing press. I don't know. Everybody just sort of believed that the U.S. was over. I could have told them that that's not the case. U.S. empire is alive and strong, and quite possibly stronger than it's ever been now. I don't think things would be much different if Trump was in office. To you, it might have happened faster. I think that Donald Trump being in power made this happen. I think that Obama, after his insanely aggressive people in his administration, did the coup in Ukraine, created the shooting war. I believe Obama was like, this is fucking nuts. We're not doing this. We're done with this. And contributed to the Minsk agreements that gave Russia a lot, to be clear. And had the United States under Hillary Clinton remained somewhat committed to the Minsk things, of course we wouldn't be that committed. It's entirely possible we wouldn't have had a war. But having Trump in there, and Trump's policy, which nobody appreciates, is that Trump, of course, loudmouth dipshit that he is, always loved to talk about how great Putin was. And yeah, I think the amount of time that Trump spent up Putin's asshole, just brown-nosing, had something to do with Putin's reluctance to invade while Putin was president, because he, like every anti-interventionist, everybody against U.S. foreign policy, imagined that maybe Trump would finally be able to act on some of the stuff that he said. He couldn't. Trump is utterly one of the most incapable presidents we've ever had, up there with Buchanan. But the problem, of course, is that during the Trump administration, because the U.S. military-industrial complex was so smart at convincing a bunch of people who couldn't believe that Hillary Clinton actually lost an election, that Russia had done it, U.S.-Russia policy under Trump was insanely aggressive. Sanctions went up. And we started doing something that Obama very wisely said he'd never do and blocked, which was start giving weapons to Ukraine. So already by the Trump administration, by the time we started arming Ukraine, I think an invasion of Ukraine became something that Putin wasn't just thinking about, was something, oh shit, I have to do this before the amount of weapons that the U.S. gives to Ukraine become too unmanageable for me. Before the invasion, I thought that these weapons were a complete waste because that, and I think this was Obama's position, because there was no way that the Ukraine, sorry, though Ukraine is the wrong way to refer to the place, that Ukraine would ever be able to threaten Russia. Apparently, I didn't realize just how crappy the Russian military was. So under Trump, Trump essentially started by providing those weapons to Ukraine, got Russia super worried. This is sort of a lot of the logic that started World War I. And Russia was like, if I'm ever going to invade, I have to do it now. So it was Trump's ass-kissing combined with a much, much more viciously anti-Russian policy that started the stopwatch on the invasion of Ukraine. But of course, it wouldn't happen during Trump's time in power because Trump, despite the actions of the U.S. government under him, continued to kiss Putin's ass so much. When Biden came to power, what he needed to do was go back to the Obama policy and say, okay, let's try and make this Minsk thing happen and stop sending weapons. That's not what he did. Instead, what Biden did, and this is, I believe, something that was already going to happen, was he basically sort of made Zelensky feel like he was super secure, like he could rely on Russia, like all the MSNBC hate from Russia would lead to much more real NATO support than was actually possible. And then we got war. So yeah, like this whole like Trump, again, it's just like a lack of appreciation for time. This idea that, oh, well, of course, you know, if Trump were president right now, well, if Trump were president right now, it's possible. I don't think we'd have made it through 4 years of Trump as president without Russia invading Ukraine. If Trump had been incapable of, but actually maybe Trump could have, a Trump who had won his election and had survived an impeachment would maybe have had the power to actually do something that was anti-Russia, sorry, to actually do something that was pro-Russia, and then maybe he could have averted this somehow by sacrificing Ukraine in some sense. That's a possibility. But this idea that like Trump would have been too tough or whatever, no, like Trump's administration is the reason this happened. I think that Biden did have some choices he could have made to accommodate Russia more, but because U.S. domestic politics have been so screwed up, didn't. So yeah, war. Oh, thank you, Fidel. That's just another super chat. That's very grateful. Very nice. Okay, so wow, we've been doing this for 2 hours. If you want to keep me going at this point, I'm going to need a super chats to keep me going. But so I will start my spiel and then I will close. My name is Robert Morris. If you're new here, I upload videos every Tuesday here at the Mo Freedom Foundation. Sometimes it's more produced videos. Sometimes it is just rants. I do daily shorts now, which is, you know, apparently having a positive effect now. So I'm going to keep doing it. But yeah, the big emphasis is, unfortunately, I've only really managed to do about 2 produced videos a month recently. But you know, that it is what it is. I am on YouTube as the Mo Freedom Foundation. I'm on TikTok as the More Freedom Foundation. I'm on Instagram as the More Freedom Foundation, trying to do more over there. You can find me on Twitter all the time at RoboLaw. Probably the best way to get in contact with me. Twitter at RoboLaw. You can find me there. This channel is entirely supported, well, by Super Chats, which I'm very grateful for, but is supported by Patreon and by PayPal. If you sign up on Patreon, you get access to a Discord server where we've got a bunch of smart folks from all over the world discussing geopolitics all day long. I don't participate over there as much as I'd like, especially over the past couple of weeks. I was in Puerto Rico on vacation when the Ukraine thing started, so it's all, a lot. It's been a lot. It's been a lot. But I'm certainly can be reached over there, and there's a lot of fun folks discussing things on the Discord. We also do once a month. We do just for the Discord, the patrons on Discord. We do like a Zoom chat. I don't prepare anything for it, but I get to see the names and see the faces and hear the voices of folks who keep this channel going, which I really really love and appreciate. And then also, if you're a patron, we get the patrons only newscast, which is once a month. There's no way that this channel can cover everything that folks want me to cover, but once a month I try, and that's for the patrons only newscast. And that is usually only 5 to 10 people show up live, and I basically answer every single question. The day before I present, I put together a list of topics. I add more topics that folks suggest. The morning before, I research each and every one of those topics for 10 to 15 minutes. But I'm able to say more than I would otherwise, like in this context. And yeah, the patrons only news chat I think is a pretty great thing that I enjoy doing. Helps me, once a month develop a broader picture of the world, and also lets me talk about things that folks want to hear about. So yeah, the patrons only news chat is great. So please sign up on Patreon. Please consider donating on PayPal. Please like, subscribe, and comment here, or on TikTok, or on Instagram, or on all these places. Okay, I've got a super chat from Star Pulsaro. I will answer this question and close unless there's another super chat. Do you think that Russia will be like North Korea, i.e. threaten nuclear war in exchange for sanction relief and economic aid? It's actually a great question, Star Pulsaro. I feel like something about Russia's dignity would be just like, I feel like Russia's more dignified than to just be a full-on gangster state like North Korea. But I think it's possible that, yeah, if we could push them into that situation, and that would be such an extraordinary tragedy. I think it's more likely that Russia would just go whole hog for subjugation to China. And just orient itself around being another Chinese satellite like North Korea. And probably, I mean, it's not like they're ever gonna be as isolated in the stands. Yeah, it would be a Russia more fully committed to being sort of an Asiatic country, I guess, which would be very interesting, and I suppose to some extent a return to form, I guess. But yeah, just because North Korea is it's a horror state, and I just don't see Russia falling that far. But maybe, yeah, I think that's a distinct possibility. I don't know, maybe I just haven't. I've been thinking a lot, what is the possibilities and potential for the world now? I haven't been thinking about potentials and possibilities for Russia because I don't see any. It's incredibly dark. Is it North Korea dark? Maybe. That's a really sad note to end on. But I think there are no more super chats. Really grateful for all this. I've been doing a lot. I'm amazed that I've gotten this many super chats and this much participation for doing essentially weekly live chats now. I don't think I'll be doing a live chat next week, but who knows? I've gotten very greedy for the success. The channel. I think I had my best month last month in 2 years. It's profiting off the suffering off of Ukraine, but I have this hope that maybe because of the I got that push from the Russia-Ukraine stuff, and I've got the daily shorts. Maybe the algorithm is, and I've complained to enough people through connections at Google and YouTube that who knows, maybe something is working out better. Probably not, but I have that hope, and maybe I'll do another live chat next week if it continues to seem to be working. True Realist asks, will Turkey be forced to go harsh against Russia? I would argue that Turkey has already gone harsh against Russia. I think that the Montreux Convention, the use of the Boaz, the use of the Bosphorus as a block against the use of refusing Russia access for its naval ships to Bosphorus, to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus, the strait, the body of water that goes through Istanbul and through Turkey. Refusing access to Russia to the Black Sea is huge. That's already Turkey being forced to go harsh against Russia. But I'm not even sure it's appropriate to characterize this as Turkey being forced. I've been talking for a number of years now about this concept of a Russo-Turkish Cold War. It's basically, the only thing Turkey has to make it look like it's an ally of NATO and the United States anymore. And I think I think we're seeing right now a lot of people, it's sort of become a common trope for people to be like, oh, like Turkey's not really an ally and Turkey shouldn't be in NATO anymore and da 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 da. And here, look at that. Turkey closing off access to the Black Sea in what is essentially a Russia-NATO proxy war. Is definitely a Russia-NATO proxy war. All of a sudden, Turkey looks very useful. So it's not necessarily Turkey being forced to go harsh against Russia. It's Turkey taking the opportunity to go harsh against Russia. That, too, is an entire... Oh, my God. I spoke for 50 minutes on what Russia-Ukraine means for Syria, yet did not talk about the Russian-Turkish relationship at the heart of the ongoing Syrian conflict. That makes me feel dumb. But thank you, True Realist. I like to close these things out feeling dumb because it means there's always more to learn. Thank you, guys. So, there's a Fadel Super Chat I missed? Where did I miss a Fadel Super Chat? Shit. Oh, I'm sorry. God damn it. I guess we're going to keep going. Where I missed a Fadel Super Chat. I'm sorry. Where did I put that? Okay, without Wagner, Haftar's security would deteriorate. Exactly, Fadel. Yeah, I agree entirely. But it's not Russia that's paying for Wagner, is it? Maybe correct me, Fadel. I'll look. But yeah, I don't believe that it is. I don't believe that it's Russia that's paying for Wagner, and there are plenty of Colombian or South African mercenaries that are happy to occupy that position. I mean, I don't know, but maybe there's less tangible effects than money. I mean, just having Russia no longer being as active a part of that, like, oh, let's see Haftar fuck things up coalition, maybe that would be significant. Maybe that would be a big deal. But yeah, the Haftar, I see Russia as a smaller player in Libya. Maybe that's inaccurate. But the UAE is, I don't know. Actually, no, because I've run videos talking about how that's part of the Russo-Turkish Cold War. Don't know. But yeah, I do know that it's the UAE that pays for the mercenaries that prop up Haftar. So, well, Turkey first to go against Russia, and then Star Pulsaro. You said Russia might identify as an Asian nation, if I heard you correctly. Can you expand on that? Well, I mean, so the classic. Some see this, but why would they? That's interesting. A classic slur that I think many generations of Russians would have looked at as something of a slur, though of course some Russians don't and choose to own it, is that, well, Russia's not really a European country. Russia's an Asian country. That's why they have this oriental despotism of the Tsar, and that's why Stalin was able to happen, because they're not really European countries that are about freedom and which of course is an approach that requires all kinds of negative views of Asia and Orientalism or what have you. But for a very long time, I think a lot of Russian thinkers, some not, but a lot of Russian thinkers have tried to run away from this idea that that Russia is as much an Asian country as it is a European one. And of course, this goes down to, nominally the Rus got their start in Kyiv. That's part of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, is that Ukraine, Russia believes that its history is Ukraine's history. And of course, the great disjunction there is when the Mongols, yeah, it was the Mongols, came roaring across Asia and made it to Poland and Hungary. They fought serious battles against both the Polish and the Hungarians. And I think this is somewhat historically contentious, but I think one of the classic arguments that if the Great Khan hadn't died of natural causes or maybe unnatural causes elsewhere, requiring everybody to go back to pick the new leader, then maybe the Mongols would have made it all the way to Spain or what have you. I don't think that's probably not true. That there's the step that the Mongols relied upon sort of runs out. And honestly, Europe just didn't have much to offer to the Mongols at that point. But anyway, the great historical disjunction for Russia and Ukraine is when the Mongols came rushing in, and sort of chased everybody into the north. Or some I guess presumably the folks who stayed became the Ukrainians or the Ruthenians. Or I am nowhere near settled on this very complicated, very contentious history. I'm sure I'm getting it completely wrong. But what became modern Russians were sort of forced up to Nizhny Novgorod and Moscow and what have you. And the genesis of the princes of Muscovy, the Moscow state, was as vassals or sort of feudal. Maybe these terms aren't entirely accurate, but as sort of paying people who were part of the Golden Horde, a sort of Mongol successor state, and into the 1500s, I believe, the princes of Muscovy or Moscow paid tribute to the Golden Horn and were subject to them. And there's a series of battles and wars of independence in the 1500s. Well, before the 1500s, and I believe in the 1500s. Am I wrong about this? I might be wrong about this, but I believe it's the 1500s, where the Russians fought to be independent. And I think, but there are real implications and influence within Russian institutions, Russian culture, that are seen as more Asian influenced because of that centuries of influence of the Mongols, the Golden Horde, Islam, everything. So Sarah Paul Sarah, what I was talking about was the possibility of moving further back towards more Asian influences. And I guess that sort of makes sense, right? Because I do believe, still, we are living in this world where, India and China were the wealthiest, most developed places on the planet. Really, you can make some quibbles, but really until like 1800, or maybe the 1750s or what have you. And then the sort of European Western world raced ahead with industrialization. And the story of the 21st century, according to many narratives, and I am sympathetic to these narratives, is that we're going to see a reversion to form, where actually India and China become the true centers of wealth and prosperity in the world again, and Europe sort of fades away. And I think Russia making a decision to consciously orient itself as more of an Asian country again would certainly be an aspect of that shift. And actually, if that happens, even with Russia being as poor and put upon as it is, that's a tremendously significant shift, and would contribute, in fact, towards. So yeah, I think that there's a lot about this current situation that China finds uncomfortable or problematic, or getting in the way of its goals of continuing to enrich itself off the West. But in a longer term, seeing Russia sort of orient itself as just another stan, Slavistan, in the orbit of the Chinese, the biggest ever in human history Chinese empire, might serve some, or at least flatter some Chinese perceived long-term goals. I think I've enlarged upon that, and there's 2 more super chats. My God, I'm never going to be able to stop, am I? Okay. Let's see if we get just 2 more. Did I miss one? Oh my God, there's so many more. Okay. Sarah Pulsaro. Hamza Tariq, could Russia give up Kaliningrad for sanctions relief? No. I would say no. I would say absolutely not. I mean, yeah, I couldn't. I can't see Kaliningrad just as the United States has to go to World War III for Estonia to give up Kaliningrad, to give up territory, to give up Russian territory. Of course, I'm well aware. This was where Immanuel Kant lived. This was Königsberg. This was German up until, was it German up until the end of World War II? Or just German till the end of World War One? Yeah, it was just, I think it was German to the end of World War II, but that is Russian territory. And officially approved Russian territory, and for Putin to give that up would just simply be an impossibility. In my view, I don't see how Russia could do that. I think certainly Putin couldn't give that up. It would have to be a dismembered Russia. I don't think we would be talking about Russia as a unified entity. A unified Russia couldn't give up a Kaliningrad, Hamza, as I think would be what I would say on that. MK said, this war made me realize there's a lot of disinfo agents online. I see it in the comments, particularly in the conspiracy community. Was that a long play by the Kremlin to influence the West? I think there's been a lot of talk like, oh, wow, all the disinformation is going to disappear because there's sanctions on Russia now, stuff which seems a little... it's more than a little ridiculous. The world is full of people who want to believe conspiracies. That's always been the case. I think we're going to find, Russia. You may not have noticed, but Russia has not been winning the information war over the past couple of weeks. It's entirely possible that Hillary Clinton might have lost that election fair and square. It wasn't just Putin's infinitely capable info warriors. It was, I think the role of savvy Russian power over the narrative, I think, has dramatically been overstated. But has Russia been pouring money into dumb ideas everywhere? Absolutely. But so has Rupert Murdoch, and so has the corporations that own CNN and MSNBC. I think there's a lot of nonsense out there, and it's not just on conspiracy boards. But yeah, there's tons of disinformation everywhere, all the time. So I guess what I'm saying is, without any real expertise on this, is like my expectation is that we're not going to see this miraculous end of disinformation because. Russia, because there's sanctions on Russia now. And I don't think that Russia was ever that clever. If you dive in to, there's this standard, 112 million people saw Russian disinformation in the run-up to the 2016 elections. And that's like, that sounds scary until you know how the Facebook tabulates that stuff. Like everything you scroll by on Facebook is something you've seen, whether you actually read it or interacted with it, or it had any impact on you at all. You've seen it or what have you because you scrolled by it. And I think the figure of things that people scroll by, that Americans scrolled by in 2016 is somewhere in the trillions. So like 12 million or 112 million or whatever it was is not that big a deal. And if you actually dive into the what that disinformation did, it's kind of laughable and was not, in fact, particularly effective. Everybody loves the fact that apparently somebody managed to organize an anti-Hillary, some Russians managed to organize a Hillary Clinton protest. And I think that, the people at that one protest in that one place were like the most interviewed people in the country over the past couple of years. So, yeah. But yeah, disinformation is real. Russian paying for disinformation is real, but I don't think it's anywhere near the scale and efficacy that we've been sold. Gray, Turkey is using NATO to make Russia toothless. This way they can control all the stands in Central Asia. I think that's really overstated. I think that Turkey kind of got played with Armenia and Azerbaijan by Russia. In November 2020, November 2020, war broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. We've got a lot of videos on that. And Turkey was famously supporting their Azeri brothers because they had the Turkic faith. I mean, as you get further east across the steppes towards China, you run out. It gets less and less close, but Azeri Turkish and Turkish in Turkey are almost mutually intelligible. Very similar languages. And supposedly Erdogan was doing this Machiavellian support of the Azeri military. Turkish drones were definitely a factor, so were Israeli drones. But in the aftermath of that fight, it was actually the Russians that ended up reoccupying two former Soviet republics, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Not totally, but getting exactly the sort of enclaves and Russian troop presences that we're so angry about in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So yeah, actually, maybe you're right. Maybe Turkey is seeing this as a way to make up for how totally they were beclowned in the Caucasus. But I think since Ataturk, a huge part of a Turkish national conception is this idea of Turkic brotherhood, with the Turkic peoples expanding from Azerbaijan and the Caucasus across whatever, it's like the Caspian Sea, right? Yikes. Across the body of water there into the stans, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. And then actually in the Xinjiang, which is one of the names for Xinjiang province in China, is East Turkestan, in fact. So it's been a huge part of Turkish national self-conception that, actually, we're the Turks, we're the leaders of this Turkic empire, and we've got this grand history, and really, this Turkish body is one big thing. That just really hasn't been the case. Russia's sort of been the big winner for a century, over a century in those areas, and it seems like China is probably going to be the next big winner in most of the Turkic world. But yeah, actually, I could kind of see that, Greg, right? That actually Turkey's kind of pleased because this will help them perhaps take back this huge loss they had to Russia in the Caucasus over the past 2 years. So that's Gray, Smart Disinfo, Hamza Tariq. Oh man, I can't believe we're closing in on 2.5 hours, folks. U.S. foreign policy is the best argument for Arab unity. No argument there, Fadal. We certainly worked very hard for a very long time to crush Arab unity. I sometimes fear we may have succeeded. I think, Fadal, you're very bullish on the idea of Arab countries getting together, and I certainly wouldn't be opposed to it. But I do wonder if there's just too much history under the bridge now at this point for Arab unity to be a real possibility. All right, any more super chats? I'm fading, but we'll continue talking for more money because I am what's the word? Broke. Not broke, but anyway, yeah, I'm rambling a little. Rob Morris, More Freedom Foundation on TikTok and Instagram. Robo Law on Twitter. Please consider joining us on Patreon, joining us on the Discord server that is for patrons only, the patrons only news chats. I wrote some books. I wrote a book called Avoiding the British Empire, and a book called Everybody's Lying About Islam. You can just find those by Googling Avoiding the British Empire or Everybody's Lying About Islam. Those are some books that I wrote, and you should look those up. I'm actually pretty proud of those. Maybe purchase them because that'd be great. And I'm okay. 2.5 hours of me talking is enough even for me. Thank you so much. This channel does not exist without the folks who show up and watch it. I'm tremendously grateful. You are the best. And I'm ending the stream.